The deed was already signed before Senna found out what her uncle had done. She heard it from the postmaster's wife, of all people, a woman named Gertrude, who had never once in her life kept a piece of news longer than 10 minutes. Gertrude caught Senna on the steps of the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning, grabbed her by the wrist, and said in a voice that carried halfway down the street, "Did you know your uncle sold the grazing rights and the cabin to Potlatch Danner? Lord, girl, you look pale as flour." Senna didn't answer. She couldn't. The words landed somewhere behind her sternum and just sat there, heavy and wrong, like swallowing a stone. She walked back to the cabin. Her mother's cabin. The cabin her father had built with his own hands before the fever took him, and she sat down on the porch step and looked at the mountains and tried to breathe. The deed was in Danner's name now. Uncle Craw had signed it for a sum that wouldn't have bought a decent mule, let alone 300 acres. And a structure that had stood 30 years through every winter the Cascades could throw at it. She had nowhere to go. She was 26 years old. Her parents were both dead, and she had nowhere to go. Danner came 3 days later. He was not a large man, but he had a way of filling a room that had nothing to do with size, something in how his eyes moved, calculating and slow, like he was always adding up what things were worth. He came with 2 men she didn't recognize, and he stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked around the inside of it, the way a man looks at a horse he's just bought and is already deciding how hard to work it. "You've got a week," he said. "Maybe 10 days if you're quiet about it." "This was my father's land," Senna said. "It's my land now," he said it. Without heat, without apology, the way you'd state the temperature outside. Just a fact. Just the way things were. "Your uncle needed the money. That's not my concern." She didn't beg. She wanted to. There was something in her chest that rose up hot and humiliated, something that wanted to grab his sleeve and plead. But she pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and she stood very still until he left. Then she sat down on the floor of her mother's kitchen and cried until there was nothing left. The week passed the way bad weeks do, faster than you want them to, slower than you can stand. Senna packed what she could into 2 trunks and a canvas sack. She sold the iron stove to the blacksmith for $8. She sold her mother's good dishes for $3. She had $41 total when she was done, and a mule named Birch who was 14 years old and had opinions about everything. She had no plan. She knew a woman in Harrow who might give her work, laundry, mostly, maybe some cooking. But Harrow was 40 miles north, and the passes were unpredictable in March, and Senna had not traveled that road alone before. She left on a Thursday. She made it 11 miles before the weather turned. The snow came in sideways off the ridge, the kind of snow that doesn't fall so much as a tack, and Birch stopped dead in the middle of the road and refused to move, with a conviction that Senna could not argue with. She could barely see 10 feet in front of her. The temperature was dropping fast. She had a blanket and a half, a loaf of bread, and $41 that would do her no good at all if she froze to death on the eastern face of the Cascades. She got off the mule and led him into the trees, looking for anything. A rock face, an overhang, anything that would break the wind. What she found instead was light. What she found was a light. It was far off and dim through the trees. The kind of light that might have been a lantern, or might have been her mind, inventing something she needed. But she went toward it because there was nothing else to do. She pulled Birch along behind her, and the snow kept coming, and the light kept getting slightly, tantalizingly larger, and then she was at the edge of a clearing. And there was a cabin, not a large one, barely larger than 1 room, with a lean-to attached on the north side, and smoke coming from the chimney in a way that meant someone was actually inside. She stood at the tree line for a moment, her face entirely numb, and then she crossed the clearing and knocked on the door. Nothing happened for long enough that she considered knocking again. Then the door opened. The man who filled it was larger than the doorframe wanted him to be. He had to tilt slightly to fit, wide in the shoulders, with the kind of build that comes not from effort but from years of actual work, hauling, lifting, pushing against the mountain itself. Dark hair, gone silver at the temples, a beard that had not been attended to in some time. He was holding an oil lamp and looking at her with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite surprise. Something between the two, controlled and flat. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Birch. He looked at the snow coming down behind her. He stepped back from the door. That was all. No words, no questions. He just moved aside, and she understood she was allowed to come in. She came in. The inside of the cabin was small and spare and very warm. A wood stove in the corner put out heat like a furnace. There was a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of supplies, a sleeping area behind a partial wall. Everything had a place. Everything was in it. The man moved to the stove without speaking and poured something from a pot. Coffee, she realized, or something close to it, and set the cup on the table. She sat down. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Her fingers took a long time to start working again. "I'm Senna," she said. "My mule quit on the road about a quarter-mile east. I was trying to make Harrow." He looked at her. "Not tonight," he said. 2 words. That was it. But he was right, and they both knew it. His name, she learned eventually, not that night. But the next morning, when the snow had settled into something navigable, and she had slept in the chair by the stove because he had offered nothing else and she had not asked, was Beckett, just Beckett. No family name offered, none requested. He was, she guessed, somewhere in his early 40s, though the mountains had a way of aging a man that made it hard to tell. He had come to this particular ridge 7 years ago, he told her, in the same flat way he told her everything, not unfriendly, not warm, just factual, the way you'd describe the weather or the depth of a well. Why? She asked. He looked at the window for a moment. Needed to be somewhere quiet, he said. She understood, somehow, that this was the whole of the answer, and she didn't push. She had planned to leave the next morning. The snow said otherwise. The pass road was buried under 2 feet, and Birch, who was already elderly, and had the temperament of a retired judge, made it clear, within 30 seconds of being saddled, that he had no intention of going anywhere, so Senna unpacked what she needed, and stayed another night, and then another. And, by the end of the first week, she had started cooking because she needed something to do with her hands, and by the end of the second week, Beckett had stopped looking vaguely surprised every time he came in from the cold to find her there. He didn't talk much. She was used to quiet. Her father had been a quiet man, and so she didn't fill the silence with noise, which she suspected he noticed. In the evenings he would sit with a book, or with his work. He did trapping and some hunting, sold the pelts in town twice a year, and she would sit across from him and mend things or read or simply watch the fire, and they existed in the same room with a kind of ease that shouldn't have developed as fast as it did. She told him about the land on the 4th night. She hadn't planned to. It came out during supper, something about the way he'd asked, simply and without preamble, where she was going in Harrow, and she'd said, work, and he'd said, what kind, and somehow by the end of it she had told him the whole thing. Dana, Uncle Craw, the deed, the 30 years her father had spent on that land, the $41 in her coat pocket. Beckett listened the whole time without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your uncle have the right to sign?" he asked. "Technically," she said. "My father put the land in both their names after my mother died, in case something happened to him." She looked down at her plate. He trusted him. Beckett said nothing else, but something shifted in his face, barely perceptible, a tightening around the jaw, a stillness in the eyes, and she filed it away without knowing why. The snow kept coming. March in the Cascades is not a gentle month. She stopped thinking about leaving every morning, and started thinking about it only occasionally. The way you think about a letter you keep meaning to write. She helped with what she could. She was not helpless, had never been helpless, and it irritated her in a bone-deep way to sit idle. and Beckett accepted her help without comment, neither grateful nor dismissive, just matter-of-fact about it, as if she had always been there dividing the labor. There was a rhythm to it that she hadn't expected. Up before dawn. Coffee. The animals. Beckett kept 2 horses and a small flock of chickens in the lean-to, and they had strong feelings about the time of day. Then breakfast, then the separate work of the day, then supper, then the quiet evening. It was more orderly than her life had ever been in the cabin with her father, where things had happened as they needed it to, where time moved loosely and without much structure. This was different. Beckett moved through the day like a man who had built his routine out of necessity and then discovered he preferred it. She asked him once, about 3 weeks in, if he missed people. He thought about it for longer than she expected. Some, he said finally. Not most. Which ones? He looked at her, and something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite read. My brother, he said. He died about 8 years back. I'm sorry, Senna said. He was a good man, Beckett said. And that was all he said, and she didn't press, but for the rest of the evening she was aware of a kind of weight in the room that had not been there before. Not unpleasant, exactly, but present, like he had set something down that had been in his hands for a long time. Dana came in April. She shouldn't have been surprised. She had stayed longer than she meant to, and the valley was not large, and people talked, but she had not thought of Dana in weeks, had not thought about much beyond the daily work of the cabin, and the strange, particular comfort of Beckett's silence. And so when she heard the horses in the clearing, when she looked out the window and saw Dana and one of his men picking their way across the mud, her stomach dropped hard. Beckett was outside, splitting wood. She saw him stop when he heard the horses. She saw him set the axe down slowly, deliberately, with the care of a man who is making a decision about what to do with his hands. Dana reined up in the yard and looked around the clearing, and then at Beckett with that flat, assessing look of his. Looking for a woman, he said. Goes by Senna. Heard she was sheltering up here. Beckett said nothing. He picked up the axe again. She owes money, Dana said. Or her uncle does, which amounts to the same thing. I've got paper on it. Paper on a person, Beckett said. His voice was very even. Paper on a debt. She's the one left standing, so she's the one who pays it. Beckett turned and looked at Dana, with an expression that was not threatening, exactly. It was something colder than threatening, something more like the face of a man examining a thing he has already decided about. There's no debt here, he said. You bought the land, you got what you paid for, the way I understand it. The way I understand it, Beckett said. You got 300 acres and a cabin for less than they were worth, because a man needed money fast. That's a transaction. That's done. There's nothing else owed. Dana looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the axe. He looked at the size of the man holding it, and at the particular quality of stillness in Beckett's stance, the kind of stillness that is not the absence of intention, but the absolute presence of it. She's here, Dana said, not a question. She's not your concern, Beckett said. The silence stretched. Dana's man shifted in his saddle. The horses were restless in the mud, tossing their heads, and somewhere in the lean to the chickens had gone very quiet. You want to take on someone else's trouble, Dana said. That's your business. He gathered his reins. But this isn't finished. For you it is, Beckett said. Dana looked at him for another long moment, and then he turned his horse and rode out of the clearing. And his man followed him, and Beckett stood in the yard until the sound of the hoofbeats had faded completely. Then he picked up the wood he'd been splitting and carried it to the porch and stacked it, piece by piece, in total silence. Senna watched from the window. Her heart was still going fast, a scared rabbit flutter that she was embarrassed by. She waited until he came inside, and then she said, You didn't have to do that. Beckett set the last piece of wood by the stove. He didn't look at her right away. Yes, I did, he said. She didn't know what to do with that. She turned back to the stove and stirred the soup that didn't need stirring, and the warmth of the cabin settled around them both, like something solid. That night, she lay awake for a long time in the sleeping area. He had given it to her, insisting, without much argument, and taken the chair by the fire himself. And she looked at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening inside her. Not just gratitude, though there was plenty of that. Something else. Something that had been building in the particular way that quiet things build gradually and without announcement until one day you look up and realize it's been there for a while. She thought about the way he had said, "That's done," like it was simple, like the fact that she was here, in his cabin, in his care, was simply the way things were now, and no further discussion was required. She thought about his brother. She thought about 8 years of quiet. She fell asleep eventually, and she dreamed about the land. Not her lost cabin, not Dana's face, but the mountains themselves, the ridgeline in the early morning light, and she was looking at it from somewhere she'd never been before, and it was beautiful. 3 days after Dana's visit, Beckett didn't come back for supper. She didn't notice right away. The light changed, and she kept the soup warm, and told herself he was checking the fire traps, which sometimes took longer. Then the dark came in full, and there was still no sound from the yard, and she took the lantern to the door and looked out at the clearing, and saw nothing but snow and pine, and the cold, indifferent dark. She waited another hour. Then she put on her coat and took the lantern and went out. She found him at the edge of the tree line, half sitting against a pine, one hand pressed to his side. His face, when the lantern light hit it, was the color of old ash. He looked up at her with an expression that was almost annoyed. At himself, she realized, not at her, as though being found was an inconvenience he was embarrassed to have caused. "There was a man," he said. "Dana sent him, most likely, by the south trail." She crouched down beside him. His coat was dark on the left side. She pressed her hand there, and he made a sound, barely, through his teeth. "How bad?" she said. "Not good," he said, which from a man like Beckett she understood to mean, "Worse than I want to tell you." She got him inside. She did not let herself think about how heavy he was, or how far, or how her arms were shaking by the time she got him through the door. She got him to the sleeping area and got his coat off and looked at what was underneath, and then she went to the stove and heated water and got every piece of cloth she could find, and she went to work. Her mother had been a practical woman. Senna had seen wounds before. Farm country produced them regularly, and she had helped clean and bind more than a few. She worked slowly and steadily, and she did not let her hands shake though they wanted to. The wound was deep but had missed anything critical, or so she believed, or so she told herself. Beckett lay still throughout. He watched her work with that same flat, controlled expression he wore for most things, the one that gave very little away, except that once, when she pulled the wound tight, he closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, there was something there that was not quite pain and not quite relief, but somewhere between the two. "You're going to be fine," she said. She said it the way her mother had always said it. Not as comfort, exactly, but as instruction, a fact she was establishing. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He almost smiled. Barely, just the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth, and she looked away and kept working. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the chair by the bed and kept the fire going, and checked on him, every hour, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest in the firelight, listening to his breathing for any change. Sometime around 3 in the morning the wind picked up, and she put more wood on the fire and sat back down and watched him sleep and thought, "This is not how I expected any of this to go." By morning, his color was better. He woke up slowly, in stages the way badly hurt people do, and when he finally got his eyes fully open, he looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then at her. "You were here all night," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, something she was starting to recognize, the particular look he got when he was working something out, when there was something he wanted to say that he didn't know how to approach. "Why?" he said finally. It was not a challenge. It was a genuine question, quiet and almost careful, like he thought he already knew the answer and wasn't sure what to do with it. She looked at him. "Because you're the only person," she said, "who ever stepped in front of something for me without asking what you'd get for it." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the morning was very still. "Your mule got into the chickens last night," he said. She laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind she hadn't had in months, and Beckett, watching her, wore an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Unguarded, open, just barely warm, like something had been held in a closed fist for a very long time and had just quietly been let go. He healed slowly. He was not a patient man about it. He pushed too early, twice, and she told him so plainly, both times, and he looked at her the way he looked at weather, that was worse than expected, and then did what she said, which she counted as a victory. She brought his meals to him. She managed the animals and the wood and the water, and she did it, without being asked and without making a production of it, and after a few days he had stopped watching her with that slight wariness, that faint assessment, and had started watching her with something else. Attention, she thought. Real attention, the careful kind. One afternoon, she came in from the yard, and he was sitting up, reading, and he said without looking up, "There's a letter on the table." She looked. There was a letter, in an envelope, with the name of a land office she recognized. "What's this?" she said. "I wrote to the county about your father's deed," he said. He turned a page. "Your uncle had the right to sign as co-owner, but not without notification of the other heirs. You're an heir. They didn't notify you. That makes the transaction disputable." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I read," he said simply. He looked up then, and there was something in his expression, not pride, not satisfaction, just a quiet certainty. "It doesn't mean you'll get it back, but it means there's a case, if you want one." She sat down at the table. She looked at the letter for a long time. The land office seal, the formal careful type, the words that meant possibly, maybe, there is a door here that is not entirely closed. "Why did you do this?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because it was wrong," he said. "What happened to you?" "It was wrong, and it didn't have to be permanent." She folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket. She did not cry. She had done enough crying in the months before, and she was done with it. But she sat very still for a moment, her hands flat on the table, looking at the grain of the wood. "I don't know where I'll go," she said. "If it doesn't work, I don't have family. I don't have—" "You don't need to figure that out today," Beckett said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same careful, level attention he'd been giving her for weeks now, the kind that didn't demand anything, didn't expect anything, just saw her, plainly and completely. "No," she said slowly. "I suppose I don't. The spring came in hard and fast, the way it does in the mountains. Snow one morning, mud the next, the whole world shifting underfoot without giving you time to adjust." Beckett was on his feet again by the second week of May, moving at about 3/4 his usual pace, which she was learning was still faster than most men at full speed. He didn't thank her for the nursing. She didn't expect him to. He showed his gratitude the way he showed most things. Through action, through small adjustments, through the fact that one morning she came out to find. He'd built a second chair for the porch, a better one than the one currently there, and set it at an angle to his own so both of them could see the mountains. She sat in it that evening he came, and sat in the other one. The light on the peaks was extraordinary, that particular gold pink. That only lasts about 20 minutes in May, that makes you feel like you're watching something you're not supposed to see. They sat without talking for a long time. "The county wrote back," she said eventually. She had been carrying the letter all day, waiting for the right moment, and there was no right moment, so she just said it. "They want more documentation, My father's original deed, witness statements. It could take a year, maybe more. Beckett nodded slowly. I don't know if it'll work, she said. No, he said. You don't? She looked out at the mountains. I've been thinking, she said, about what I'd do if it doesn't, where I'd go. He was quiet for a moment. And? He said. She turned and looked at him then, this man who had taken her in, without asking why, who had stood in a muddy yard and told Dana the conversation was over, who had lain still while she stitched him up and thanked her for it 3 days later by writing a letter to a county office on her behalf, who had built her a chair for the porch without saying a word about what it meant. I think, she said slowly, I'd rather figure that out from here than from anywhere else. The mountain light was fading. Beckett looked at her for a long moment, that careful, unguarded look she'd been learning to read, the one that meant he was feeling something he didn't have easy words for. All right, he said, one word, just one. But she had been living with this man long enough to know that when Beckett said all right, he meant it the way other men would need a paragraph to say. He meant stay. He meant I'd like that. He meant in the particular economy of a man who had learned that the mountains didn't need your noise to be beautiful. You belong here, if you want to. She turned back to the mountains and breathed the cold evening air and felt something in her chest that had been clenched since the day Gertrude grabbed her wrist on the steps of the dry goods store slowly. Finally, start to ease. Birch brayed from the lean-to. Loudly and with feeling, Senna laughed. Beckett made a sound beside her, low, brief, unmistakably amused, and the mountains held them both in the fading light, and it was enough. It was, she thought, more than enough.